Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's morning exhibition, virtual exhibition tour. And we're going to be looking today at Creatures in the Margins, which is one of our many summer exhibitions that I hope you will have time to come see. I appreciate you spending your morning with me. Your continued support of the Cornell Fine Arts Museum is greatly appreciated. My name is Alexia Lobaina, and I'm the Associate Curator of Education at the Cornell. And this exhibition was one that I actually got to work on, so I'm happy to share bits of the nuance of the different artists and kind of what inspired it with you today. So Creatures in the Margins is actually based on, if you're a book lover, you know that every summer there is a national reading theme. So if you visit libraries often, you'll see these advertised. And so for this summer, the reading theme was Tales and Tales. So tales like on an animal, but tales like stories and narratives. And so we've been partnering with libraries in Orange County, Osceola County, and Sunwell County, and thought this could be a nice way of making a new connection with what's all the programming that they do on their end, and use this as a springboard to inspire an exhibition in what we call our education gallery, which is always community focused and community centered to begin with. And so what we came up with was Creatures in the Margins, margins like a book. And what this exhibition looks at is different ways in which animals have inspired folklore or specific narratives within religions and cultures, and how these species that don't have personalities in the way that people do are interpreted within a wholly human context. So we say things like, oh, this fox is sneaky. I'm sure it is sneaky in the sense that it hunts, but it's not in the sense that we understand it from a human perspective. So just a romp through 4 different artworks is what we're going to be doing today, that kind of looks at how these associations that we've made kind of trickle down and inspire artists working today. 3 of the 4 that we're going to be looking at are going to be contemporary artists. So one of them is from the 19th century. So we're going to get started with our first work, which is by the artist Amy Sullman. This is titled After Metamorphosis, and it is a video installation from 2015. So what you're seeing here on the screen is a still, and we're going to look at 2 more in just a couple of minutes from the video, which is just over 5 minutes long. I would love to have played it for you, but I am just looking to prevent any and all technical disruptions. So I'm not. But I do encourage you to either come visit us at the museum, which is always what I would recommend the most, to come see it, and this will be up through August. Or if you look it up online, I'm pretty sure you can find it through a quick Google search. But I do encourage it. So Amy Sullman is an American artist, and her work is dedicated to exploring shape and to explore most specifically non-representational shape, as we can kind of see here. Like, this looks like it might be the head of a woman, but at the same time, it's made up of fragments. So the artist has suggested that this might have to do with a neurological condition that she has, where she cannot see space, like the space between things. So her work has developed its own very unique, not just look, but process because of this. And so she describes her painting style, but then also later now her mixed media works, and this would include her time-based media, as a collapsing of different sections and different layers. And so we see that here in what this entire video is, or how it's composed, which is something that she calls animated drawings. So basically, she hand sketches, but then she takes those sketches, and now that she has what she calls user-friendly technology through an iPhone, she takes pictures and creates these digital sketches on her iPad and layers the hand-drawn sketches, which she has photographed, with the digital sketches. So it creates a really neat process, but then the effects are quite lovely. So how does this connect with animals, right? If you look from the title, After Metamorphosis, this is inspired by the epic poem Metamorphosis by Ovid from 8th CE. And so I don't know if you guys are familiar with it or have read it, but basically Metamorphosis, the original, the poem, is composed of 15 volumes and basically takes Greek mythology and places it into this long chronological, I was going to say epic narrative, which is what it is, but basically detailing from the creation of the universe until modern Rome, being Ovid's modern Rome, obviously, not ours. And so all the Greek stories that we're familiar with, they're given Roman names because they're translated over into to become part of the Roman, so now I guess Greco-Roman mythology. But basically, every myth you've ever heard of is going to be likely in this tome. And so one of the fascinating ways that they incorporated animals, if you think of a lot of myths, is usually that a human has angered a god and they've been turned into an animal out of punishment, or a human has befriended a god, and for some reason, either through protection, as we'll see in one of the stories that we'll be looking at today, they get turned into an animal. And so animals occupy this almost neutral position where they absorb some of the vice of man. If we're looking at the more negative tales, where it's where the transfiguration happens as part of a punishment. And so in Sullman's work, we basically have a modern day retelling that's technology based. So it's kind of nice to see how in her process, it's a mixture of digital and analog, but in the scope of the work, we also have, the very modern based in technology, meeting, the world's longest way of record keeping, which is, these epic narratives, which are part of the oral tradition. And so the way that this looks, and I'm going to skip ahead to some more images so that you can see the way that this looks on the screen is you have this multi-sensory, very fluid film experience that feels cyclical, right? You're not looking at it as, scene one ends, the next one begins. One feeds into the other. Characters kind of bleed and blend into new animals that become people, that become landscape. But they're still quite fragmented. You can pull things apart. You can tell, oh, this is this narrative. This feels familiar. I see, a laurel tree or stag, and it kind of it triggers what we might be looking at. And so these are two of the different animal transfigurations that occur both in Metamorphosis, the poem, but also in Amy Sullman's work. And the first one on the top is a spider. It's not the most normal looking spider, which is what I mean by she has a bit of a non-representational, but in this specific frame, I was able to capture it in one of those moments where it actually does hold together, and it is very much a spider. And so this is the tale of Arachne. For those of you who know, Arachne was this woman who was a wonderful weaver, and she boasted of how talented she was at weaving. And so Athena, or in Metamorphosis, but we're going to go with the Roman name Minerva, finds out, and she challenges her to a weaving contest. Minerva creates a lovely tapestry that basically is showing narratives, honoring the gods and showing them in all their splendor. And then Arachne creates also a beautiful tapestry, but the theme is the direct opposite, which is just completely slandering, not slandering because it's she's not wrong, but highlighting all the bad things that the gods do, the way that they're cruel to people, the way that they manipulate things, and how they're, they're drunk on Mount Olympus, and this is all, and this is all included in the tapestry. And this really offends Minerva, and it says that she beats her with the loom that she used to make the tapestry. I've seen it many ways. The point is, Arachne ends up dying, whether by her own hand or by Minerva's. Again, I read it both ways. But then after her death, Minerva turns her into a spider so that she can spend her days weaving, which I think is a pretty passive aggressive move. So it could be, I've read it where it's, she felt remorse over her actions and she turned her into a spider so that she can do her favorite activity for all time. But I've also read it where it's like, I'm really going to just show off at this point. But the point is, Arachne becomes a spider, and here she is featured in Sullman's work. Below her, we see two bears, and that's the story of Callisto and her son Arcas. So Callisto was one of Diana's, which would be Artemis in Greek, but Diana in Roman. She was one of her favorite huntresses, and so Jupiter, who is Zeus, falls in love with her and impregnates her, which makes Juno, Hera, very jealous, and so she turns Callisto into a bear. And then before she became a bear, she had, this is important, Hera finds out because she gives birth to her son Arcas, and so now she is a bear, and she befriends Arcas. He doesn't know that's his mother, sorry. So he shoots an arrow. He's going to hunt the bear, but right before it hits Callisto, Zeus takes pity, or Jupiter, and takes them out of the earth and throws them into the heavens, and they become the constellations Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, which are illustrated as bears. So it's also a nice origin story for a constellation. And these are just some of the different stories that you will see within this film. I did say it's a multisensory experience, so we actually can hear a soundtrack when we watch this film, and it's by a Berlin-based German artist named Wiebke Tjarks, and so she collaborated with Amy Sullman to create. It's a soundtrack, but don't think of it as a harmonious musical accompaniment to this image, to this film. It's really it's fragmented, just like what you're seeing, where it's a combination of sounds, but they are musically composed. So it's jarring, and it's kind of asynchronistic, but it actually fits the piece perfectly, and it changes the experience of watching it. So definitely one of my favorite works, I think, across the board from our collection. And I do encourage you to watch it in any way that you can. So moving on to our next piece, it's chilling and adorable at the same time. But this is The Catastrophe by Mary Russell Smith, which is an oil painting from 1864. And it can definitely be said that art runs in Mary Russell Smith's blood, because she was born into a family of established artists. Her mother, who is Mary Priscilla Wilson Smith, was a painter known as a florist and also for her landscapes. Her father, William Thomas Russell Smith, was a landscapist who was greatly influenced by the Hudson River School. But he was also a very talented and sought after painter for theater scenes, and like sets and stage curtains. And then there's her brother, Xanthus Smith, and he was a marine painter who was known for his depictions of battlefield fleets during the Civil War. So from a very early age, Mary is exposed to painting. And she showed great artistic promise in her early adolescence, becoming particularly adept at painting images of baby chickens, which was a hobby that she'd practiced her entire life. She used to raise chickens. And she was actually quite accomplished. She got to exhibit at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. She exhibited work during the Centennial Exhibition, also in Philadelphia in 1876. But unfortunately, her career short-lived. She had a chronic illness and died at the age of 36. But then in her honor, because, you know, she was, she accomplished a lot in a time that women were really, they didn't have the same kind of opportunities to exhibit their work. And so in her honor, when she passed away, her father created the Mary Smith Prize through the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. And that was, it's since defunct since 1968, but while it lasted, it really was aimed at women, promoting women and artists during a time when most of these prizes that existed rarely really went to women. So it was a way of fostering new opportunities. But returning to the painting, in the Catastrophe, we basically see Smith's talents at depicting different avian species and highlighting them. They're fallen victim to something here, but still, if we look past that for a second, we really see how skillful she was at capturing all the intricate details. If you look here, that, you know, these feather-covered bodies, this is not simple. So she was very talented, particularly with birds. But, you know, if she spent a lifetime observing them and working with them, it's not surprising. But here we have what is like a weasel or maybe a stoat, most likely a weasel, staring up at the viewer. And beside the weasel, we've got, it's two victims likely attacked by the weasel. And we can see that there's blood here, but also behind the birds a little bit. And weasels do attack from behind the back of the head. So likely it was the weasel who did this. But we also see her deviating from, you know, shows her range. She's deviated from just showing birds, and we see her work with other, at illustrating other animals. And so this work also is a really good example of showcasing Smith's frequent, really consistent use of a barnyard setting as a backdrop. And through these settings, she examines food struggles between species of not just avian, but arboreal and land animals as well. And I'm using the term backdrop intentionally here because if you look at her body of work, there is a theatricality to the way that she positions these animals in these groupings. And it makes me think of stage settings, and knowing now that her father was involved with creating theater sets and working with theaters, it could be, you know, something that kind of trickled down into her awareness of how she creates environments. So a fun food for thought, but something that I've always noticed. In addition, scholars have also suggested that despite this scene demonstrating, you know, this snapshot of, you know, a life cycle within the natural world, it also carries meanings about the American Civil War. If we look at the date, 1864, this was painted just 1 year before the war's conclusion. And because her brother, yes, he painted these Marine fleets, but also he was enlisted and he participated in the war through the U.S. Navy. So she has a connection to this, to someone that had an internal understanding of what being a part of war was, right? So she's maybe more connected to these themes and to these ideas and these anxieties than someone whose family wasn't in the war. And so if you think about it, you substitute the barnyard for a battleground, these interactions between animals, they hold different undercurrents of cruelty and of survival. If we look at the weasel, you know, there's different cultural symbolisms that are connected to the weasel, and you know, they're understood to be stealth and to be tireless hunters. And so these are, and they're also connected actually with life cycles, life and death cycles. So these are themes that align quite nicely with a possible additional layer of interpretation that are connected with the theme of war. So hunting, being a predator, being stealth, and then life and death. So it's a small work, but it's a mighty one. So it's definitely one to consider. Our third work today is different, right? This is by Camille Monroe, a French artist, and it's titled "The Man Who Understands Animal Speech Will Be Pope." and it is a bronze and marble sculpture from 2016. In her work, Monroe explores the interrelations between societies and cultural mythology, looking at things like origin stories and drawing from religious oral traditions and Hermetic traditions. And she also incorporates lots of contemporary visual culture as source material when she creates her work. This work in particular has a really interesting backstory. I don't know if you guys remember, but back in like 2014, Pope Francis made headlines that read something like, "Pope confirms that all dogs go to heaven," which, to put it in context, because that's a pretty overblown headline, it really referred to an incident where the Pope said that heaven is open to all of God's creatures as a way of comforting this 7-year-old boy who had just lost his dog and he was in mourning. And so in this work, we see this small dog that's a little biomorphic, but it's a dog, and it is standing on this very tall structure, and it's wearing a absurdly tall hat, which is a mitra, which is the type of headdress worn by the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church. So with this anecdote, the All Dogs Go to Heaven story is not what directly inspired it, but it's really more of laying the cultural context of what was happening around another later phenomenon, also connecting the Pope with dogs, that happened immediately afterward. And it's presumptive of my part, but I'm thinking these things are related, and so I'm just laying the groundwork. But in September of 2015, so like a year later, the Pope visits the U.S. for the very first time since becoming the head of the Catholic Church. And in honor of this big event, people started dressing their dogs up in Pope costumes and taking pictures. You had the hat, the robe, the whole ensemble. And the internet was filled with them. You had the Pope dog craze. It had its own hashtag. It was definitely trending. And so that is what actually inspired this work, because like I said, she's pulling from religion, she's pulling from myths, she's pulling from stories of origin, but she's mixing these with contemporary, this contemporary visual culture of what's happening in the moment. So this popped up because, like I said, it was trending. Another possible connection that we have between dogs and popes, and really it's just an understanding why the Francis Pope conundrum relationship. But another connection might lie in the interpretation behind Pope Francis' papal name, Francis. So when a pope is elected, they pick this new name that's based on important figures in Christianity that in some way bear influence on either their belief structure or their personal programmatic vision for the Catholic Church moving forward. So with Francis, he is the very first pope in history to have chosen the name Francis after St. Francis of Assisi, who is known, there's associations there with St. Francis of Assisi and animals through his compassion and love for them. We even have like the St. Francis feast day where you bring your animals to church and they get a blessing. So there's definite connections. But in any case, in Rose's hands, this dog, with all these religious and spiritual connections, they kind of cross over the realm. They cross over from the realm of the physical world into this more religious, more spiritual space. I will not religious necessarily, but spiritual. And that's because to the artist, animals have, they become representatives of a more mysterious species to her, because humans can't understand what they say, right? So, which we see reflected in the title, right? Speech here, it's obviously something that she's thinking about. And so by dressing this dog up in the trappings of a religious, head of state in one of the major religions of the world, that idea becomes amplified and starts to suggest that divine truth is actually found in the animal world and not in the human one. And she additionally collapses the divides between different religions, because she's also drawing from references to Anubis, which is the jackal-headed god of the afterlife and of lost souls from the Egyptian pantheon. So not only does this connection exist between the canine subject matter, but also through the mixing of materials found within the sculpture. So the base of the sculpture that you're looking at is made of both Italian and Egyptian marble. So it's a nice way of integrating these two possible origin stories and creating this new metaphysical being, very spiritual metaphysical being. So in the joining of these divine figures and narratives, the effect ends up being that we take this element of spirituality outside the sphere of religion and into a more universal mystical dimension, more in line with the harmony that that is possibly found in the animal kingdom. So definitely want to look further into or to come visit in person, because it's really quite spectacular. And then our last work today, also one of my favorites. I say that about everything. I'm not lying when I say it, but they're all just really great. And this work is known as the Big Gulp Altarpiece, and it is by Gary Boulding. It is an oil triptych from 2003. And so Boulding is a professor emeritus at Stetson University in the Department of Arts, which is really close to us in DeLand, Florida. And he is known for his very satirical, really quite cheeky takes on art historical and pop cultural references. So there's a lot to unpack here. Definitely lots to see. So we're gonna take this one piece at a time, but off the bat, we have the word altarpiece in the title. And so we notice that it is painted as a triptych, which is something that's painted in 3 parts, having one here, one in the middle, and one over here. And so immediately this work starts making connections to religious altarpieces, because, you know, an altarpiece would be on an altar, which is usually, it might not be religious, but there's elements of spirituality, right, of a specific setting. In front and center right here, we've got this lamb who is bleeding forward into 3 cups. We'll unpack that in just a minute. But for now, let's think about the lamb, and let's think about the fact that this is an altarpiece. If we think of the symbology of a lamb, we think of innocence, we think of sacrifice, we think of Christ as the Lamb of God. And it is bleeding from the heart, which is a common depiction of how that representation within the very religious context is shown. And so instantly we have Christian iconography. So we're thinking sacred. Behind the lamb, we see built into the environment this gold wall, and painting things gold to suggest divinity was something that was a very common method of identifying sacred space. I think as far back as Byzantine, but definitely during the Renaissance. So there's connections here, and that is a very intentional color choice. Yes, Marilyn Monroe is in the middle of that, but we'll get to her in just a second. So we have this gold wall built into the structure. In the middle of what appears to be a gallery, we have this bleeding lamb, and we have an altarpiece. So this is really taking the idea of not so much religious, but sacred, and embedding it into what appears to be a museum gallery or an art gallery, but an art space, right? So it's starting to break down walls between the different narratives to expand. And so we think of the sacred in museums. If you think of how museums are traditionally viewed, visiting a museum has long held a history of feeling like almost like a religious experience, right? You come in, you're quiet, you look at this, but you know, not to use the word venerate, but you do almost worship at the feet of these works, these, you know, masterpiece works of art, and the museum almost comes like the sacred repository that just holds them for people to come and, you know, and reflect on them, right? So it's a commentary on that section of the art world, or that practice in the art world. But then, more narratives. If this lamb looks familiar, it's because it's actually based on this lamb from the Ghent altarpiece. Again, an altarpiece, and this is by the Brothers Van Eyck from 1432. And so we start to solidify these connections between what we're seeing in Boulding's work and this history of art, of these grand masters of art. Because, go back, not only do we have that trans-historical artistic connection through the lamb, but if we start looking at all the fragments around it, there's this, ignore the My Little Pony for now, we're going to get to that in a second, but there's this figure here, this figure here, these two paintings here, and then Marilyn smack dab in the middle. And so what we're connecting with, not just the Gulp Altarpiece, are two great works by Titian and Diego Velázquez, again, major names in the history of art. And this would be Emperor Charles of Mulberg. And then here we have a equestrian portrait of Count Duke of Olivares. So we also have figures that are important royal aristocratic figures. So if we were to interpret this in modern times, it would be old school celebrities, right? People that were known. We'll get back to Marilyn. We'll actually end with Marilyn. Let me go back to this. So these are, I'm going to go back to the original. If you look at these two figures here, in reversed order, we have this portrait of Innocent X by Diego Velázquez. Again, same guy that did the equestrian portrait that we just saw. And then we have an interpretation of one of many, really, this because Francis Bacon created a lot of studies based after paintings by Diego Velázquez of the Pope. But we have this, over here. And so we have to understand that when a contemporary artist makes a direct reference to an historical work from the past, it is taking whatever our contemporary artist is saying, but it's adding our understanding of the story that's associated with the work from the past. So here, we're connecting to something that Francis Bacon did. And so he created this series of these popes, and this one doesn't look too stressed out, but there were popes in electric chairs being electrocuted. And it was really a way of him dealing with, or really unpacking his relationship, not just to the Catholic Church, but to male figures of power. Francis Bacon came out as homosexual at the turn of the century, and he lived in Catholic Ireland, and he was the son of a very strict, devout man who ended up rejecting, basically denouncing his son after he found out what his orientation was. And so his work is constantly looking at the anxieties and the tensions between these figures. So then by Gary Boulding adopting this and inserting it within this narrative, we have not just our understanding of art spaces as these sacred spaces, but also the subversive acts of kind of having an effect on how these spaces work, right? To add to all that, we have Marilyn Monroe, and the one that we see here is this one by Andy Warhol. And so this works on two levels. On one end, you have Marilyn Monroe, again, a cult celebrity. So it kind of fits in with the fact that these are, even Pope Innocent X would have been, the head of the Roman Catholic Church during the 17th century. So everyone, it's a position of power, which is the important part. And it's really, when we start thinking of power within museums and within galleries, and you have a sacrificial lamb at the forefront of that painting, we start to think about how, there's a corruption within the way that the art world functions. Again, with, and the cult of celebrity works there. But then the fact that of all the images, it happens to be one by Andy Warhol, which in and of himself falls into the cult of celebrity, but then we also have the element of making something commercialized. And so now we have a bizarre, understanding of the art world where, yes, it's this, sacred space where everything is treated, everything's just handled on another level. It's not just human. It's the high art. But then that breeds a cult of celebrity, which kind of adds, toxifies to some extent the art world. And then we have the element of making that commercial and the idea of selling this out. So it's a long ladder of corruption, or things that need to be rectified in the artist's eyes. And so going back to our original here. So we take all that and we have this understanding, but then now based on the, that reproducibility, that commercial, these associations that are made with Andy Warhol, we look down again to the slam and it's bleeding into, I'm going to see if I can zoom in a little more, but probably not. It's bleeding into 3 big Gulp Altarpieces instead of a chalice like you would expect to see on a religious painting. Big Gulp, 7-Eleven, franchise, chain, commercial, right? And it's on top of, it's not an altar, it's an adaptation of an altar, but it's a semi-truck which transports goods. And on the semi-truck, we have these 3 dials. The one in the middle is a quarter, so money. And then we have 2 Mickey Mouse heads. And so this is where we start to bring in the animals. In addition to the lamb, we have this mouse, which has become a global, icon of not just of childhood, but if we're looking at the underbelly of it, it's, again, very commercial. And then we have these 2 My Little Ponies, which, oh, sorry, everybody. Well, while it loads, we have these 2 images of My Little Pony, which were actually quite controversial. Here we go. They were quite controversial because it's the first time that we really see what was a TV show become a marketing campaign and kind of filter into all this memorabilia. And the whole point of that was that you're advertising to children. And there's a lot of, there's questions about, exploiting kids for the purposes of money. And that comes full circle back to the sacrificial lamb in innocence. And so, like I said, a lot to unpack here. But at its core, it's the exploitation of, these innocent things, whether it's artists, like the purity of art, or whether it's the purity of childhood. So a really clever, very, very clever triptych for sure. And that is all that I have today for you guys. I want to thank you for joining me for our tour this morning. And I hope that you will come see Creatures in the Margins and explore it in person. It was such a joy to put together for you all. It will be up until August 29th, and it's a multi-generational show. So we have, it has interpretive labels for adults, but it also has labels for kids and some interactive activities that we hope you will come and, if anyone in the family can participate in the interactive activities. It's really about learning together as a family. So with that, I hope you enjoy your weekend and have a great rest of your day, and we will all see you very soon.